bear in mind the powers that be will use periods like this to try and move us in mass the way they want. But you're quite right. The demoralization of the people at the time in Germany was really what led them into the position of being able to be rebuilt, so to speak, as a unified nation under Hitler, because he spoke to them and got them in not from an economic viewpoint, but rather from that deep core human level of what it was like to be Germanic. Now, we're going to face kind of the same situation relative to the dollar dying and all those same kinds of pressures, but we have an interesting little wrinkle here, and that is that our data suggests that as the government starts to coagulate or shrink down relative to the amount of money it can spend, as most of the rest of the nation goes into unemployment and hyperinflation, some of the barriers that are between us and what the shadow government holds secret are going to fall. And some of those secrets may come out in time in order to radically change our paradigm and kick us all into an entirely new view of the future and where we will fit into it. It's quite probable at some level, I don't know, it's certainly possible that the level of probability we could assign a number, but it'd probably just be speculation. But it is probable that the government won't be able to maintain a secrecy apparatus because it won't be able to afford it. And the real thing about secrets is that they're all interrelated. So once they start coming out at the periphery, they're going to just basically tunnel right into the core, and there's nothing that the government or the officialdom can do about it. In spite of the fact that we've got one of the greatest secrecy structures on the planet, the sheer mass of the things that they're keeping secret works against them under times that we're about to face. So it may be that for instance, we find out that, oh, geez, the United States, the populace here has been paying for and refining free energy and anti-gravity since the 1950s. And, now's the time we can let it loose. That stuff has some possibility of, or some level of probability of occurring.
So what does this be like, leaks out through the internet of disaffected individuals? Or
some of that, but also we're going to face a really nasty period of time where we have food riots here in the United States.
Okay.
The situation on the planet is not good. We've got a collapsing biosphere for the planet as a whole, an unstable environment. That instability is not generated by us, and I doubt it's even aggravated by us, but it's certainly going to affect us, and it already has. If you look at things from the way that Buckminster Fuller, for instance, and other aggregators of information look at them, we're in the 8th year of a collapsing food chain, where we're having less grain output every year than the year before. This past year has been very bad for the production of food and of all different kinds. This food problem is going to actually get to the point where, combined with the death of the dollar, we're going to have starvation and potential famine here in the United States. Some of our data suggests that during food riots, some areas of what is now nominally in the control of the U.S. government and actually is owned and paid for and controlled by the shadow government behind our government, some of these areas are going to be looted because people will think they're vast storehouses of food. And instead they won't find food, but they'll release some of this other information, and once that process starts, there you go.
They'll find vast warehouses full of file cabinets.
Well, not necessarily even that. Who knows? Maybe a big hole in the ground with a couple of spaceships, for all I know. But what we do know is that they're underground, and they'll be rather shocked. But again, once it hits the internet, then it's there for everyone, and it starts this process going.
Interesting. One question that we've had asked here is there any data concerning higher education? What's going to happen, I guess, to our education system, or changes, effects of this on that?
Well, we're actually, from my viewpoint, I'll be real cynical here, the collapse of the dollar will allow us to have an educational system instead of a school system. And there's a big difference between the two. The higher education system, that is to say, higher education, in my opinion, is only self-directed now. Anything coming out of a school system is limited to how academia wishes you to believe. And anything that's guided by a peer review system is obviously demented to begin with, because it allows the least among us to regulate what is allowed within everybody's purview. So, but at the moment, what they're probably asking about is relative to the K through 12 situation. How are we going to deal with that? And as part of the dollar collapse, the university structures as we have them now will collapse at the very beginning of this process. So if we get into really heavy dollar collapse, say in March of next year, then I would suspect just before March we'd start seeing universities in dire need, shutting doors, can't get funding, being on their knees with the federal government, desperate for bailouts. But it won't matter at that stage because we'll have hit hyperinflation and they won't be able to print the money fast enough.
So will they begin to print the money as a way of trying to desperately patch it together, and then it just gets to the point where it becomes the dollars become worthless? Is that how you see it unwinding? In other words,
that's already happened. Actually, I mean, you have to think about it that way. They printed trillions of digital dollars and handed them out right and left, and nothing has improved. There's been a bunch of happy talk that's going to go away here real quick. Once the happy talk is gone, the despair is going to settle in, and then the actual real repercussions come from that. We already have tens of thousands of people that used to be students that can't get student aid or loans and can't continue. The stress is being felt everywhere. To think otherwise means you're simply not paying attention.
Cliff, we need to take a short commercial break, and we'll be right back here momentarily. Welcome back to CPNLive.com. I'm Tom Brush, your host, and today's guest is Clif High, author of the report known as The Shape of Things to Come. We were just talking about some of the economic implications of what the data in the report reveals, and we had another question here from one of our chat listeners, Cliff, and that was if the dollar is going to flop, basically, is there going to be any kind of a global currency introduced, and will it be successful?
We don't have anything in our data to suggest that. No, it's going to have big impacts on other currencies as the dollar goes down. There's no real suggestion at this point that anything other than an ounce of gold or an ounce of silver will be accepted or a gallon of oil, something will be accepted as currency in the future.
Okay.
Basically, the long-term stuff we do show, though, shows a calorie-based economy, energy, extra food calories, and then secondary storage of wealth in the form of silver and gold and other precious metals.
Sure, and that makes sense. And I think that if you look at what's happened in the metals markets, particularly the physical metals markets over the last year since the banks started collapsing, there seems to be a recognition of that. There's shortages, have been shortages of silver and gold coins and the kind of things that people can actually use to trade with, and yet I hear other people saying that the public yet really hasn't woken up to the need for storing wealth in gold or silver. It's kind of a conflicting situation.
There's just so many of us that the vast majority have not indeed picked up on this yet. And I think a lot of these things move through society the way Moore described the movement of technology through corporations. That there's a visionary stage where a few people, pathfinders, if you will, go out and discover it. Then there's the early adopters, and then there's this gap. And then there's the mainstream that starts to pick up on it after that gap exists. And we're just crossing that gap relative to gold and silver, I think. Because our data suggests that the panic to own, because we get everything in linguistics, we get little phrases that are interesting. And relative to gold and silver, sometime in January of this coming year, the words will be panic to own, as though everybody suddenly wakes up and says, oh, I got to go get some of that.
Wow. So the time to acquire it, if you've got the means, would be now rather than later, I suppose.
That would make sense. Do it before everybody else panics. Yeah. Save your panic for later,
One thing I wanted to ask you about that was kind of interesting, you talk about the swine flu virus and maybe a more deadly version of that being sprung on the public, maybe in conjunction with the Olympic Games, and then people refusing to be inoculated, and that playing into this whole dance. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, there's two specific waves of what we call the refuseniks, and that'll be a more or less loosely organized group of individuals that simply won't go along with the powers that be propaganda about the vaccine and about the disease. And the first wave will be relative to parents who don't want their children vaccinated this fall within a month or so. And then the second wave will be in January or February. The second wave will be relative to the wider scale distribution of a much more lethal version of the virus. our data suggests that what's going to happen is somebody who does take or people, not an individual necessarily, who do take the vaccine this fall will contribute to the mutation of it, and we'll get another wave of it in January or February that's actually a much nastier bug, although even that said, it'll be on its way to de-evolving into something less lethal. Its lethality won't be an issue much past June or July of 2010, but it's going to be at least very hyped in the January-February time period, and it will appear as though the Olympics here in Canada will act as a distribution vehicle for the virus on a global scale.